Oh, will you join me in prayer? And give thanks to you, loving Spirit, for your presence here with us now. And we thank you for your words, your thoughts, your actions that come through me in this moment in time, that my words may be meditations of your heart, beating forth, that our lives are being transformed at this time, in all aspects and in all ways. And we claim this so. Amen. Our opening story this morning comes to you from Linda Fisher, who sent this to me yesterday. It seems that there was a new pastor who was visiting the homes of his parishioners. And at one house, it seemed obvious that someone was there, but no one was answering the door. So therefore, he took out his business card and wrote Revelations 3:20 on the back of it and stuck it in the door. The following Sunday, the card appeared in the offering plate, and on it was written Genesis 3:10. And he decided just to look up both scriptures just to be sure. And Revelations 3:20 begins, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And Genesis 3:10 says, I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked. Indeed, it makes sense. I usually call before I come, by the way, just in case anybody's worried. Today we are continuing our celebration of the nation's 243rd birthday, and I titled this talk, Declaration of Dependence. Slightly different than what we are accustomed to when we celebrate the Declaration of Independence. When our founding fathers gathered together and signed this incredible document which launched our nation. Now, the preamble to the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in that, we like to think of our nation as one that really celebrates individualism. And it is our American dream to be an individual and to follow our individual dreams to achieve and succeed them. And by virtue of being a part of this country, we are endowed with these rights. And these rights help us make our dreams become a reality. And yet, through this idea of individualism, and through the idea of creativity and possibility, and we make plans and assembling the pieces, we forget sometimes that all that we are and all that we do and all that comes to be is because of God. Our human nature, that sensate man, kind of grasps what it sees. We think sometimes that what we see is what is. And that we are our egoic self. Our ego is in control. We make these things happen. We do these things, and they become reality. But it's a very limited way of looking at it, isn't it? Because we know that in our lives that we are spiritual beings having this human experience. And the idea of the good that we create through being the sensate person is very limited. It's temporary. It's momentary. In fact, the nature of sensate man is to find dependence on what supports our ego, isn't it? We go out and we look for support, things that says that we're important as a living, breathing individual, as someone who thinks on their own. We find all kinds of support to assist this illusion that we have. We find support in what makes us feel comfortable. And what makes us feel comfortable sometimes is the illusion that we create about our lives. And from this, we find ourselves oftentimes in very unhealthy relationships, habits, addictions, and disease. And we find that we're not independent at all. In fact, we're quite dependent. So in the 12 steps of recovery, the first 3 steps are we admitted we are powerless over our addiction and that our lives have become unmanageable. And we come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the third one, which I think is, that's why I highlighted it, we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. Sometimes we find that the independence of our egos takes us to a place that we hadn't expected. Because the ego lies to us. It tells you something is real when in fact it really isn't real in the sense of a spiritual being. It's very real in the sense of a human existence, but it's not very real in the sense of a spiritual being. We find that our independence took us to a dependence on something completely outside of ourselves. And then our lives become about satiating our addictions, whatever they may be. For some, it may be alcohol, and for some, it may be food, it may be shopping, it may be whatever it is that comes in our lives that we give power to. But that's what we do. And in recovery, as in the 12 steps of recovery, we discover that the first step to healing is to realize, admit, and believe that the power to healing is not what we can do as an individual, but to the power that is greater than our ego self. So we turn that power over to whatever we call it, God, our higher self, our higher purpose, the universe, universal love, to source. We turn it over. Now, Jesus was very clear that he was dependent on God. Jesus said to them in John 5:19 and 20, "Very truly I tell you that the Son can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise." The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing, and he will show him greater works than these, so that you'll be astonished. So Jesus knew his power came from God, who he called Father. And Jesus acknowledged that everything he did, came through this power. And Jesus also acknowledged that he was totally dependent on it. There was no way around it. He had to rely on that power to be who he was, to be the Christ, to allow that Christ essence to come forward. And he promised that we could do that too, that we had that exact same power if our dependence was on God. In John 8:28 and 29, so Jesus said, "When you lifted up the Son of Man, and you will realize that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own, but I speak these things as the Father instructed me. And the one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what is pleasing to him." Jesus really got that he was the Christ, and the Christ was alive in him, and he could not be that Christ without a total devotion and reliance upon God. And that we're all dependent on that guidance. I was doing some metaphysical reading about dependence, and this is what I came up with by Jim Lewis. He says, he, meaning Jesus Christ, is here to help us become more independent, or rather, he is here to help us become more dependent upon the Christ within us. God, and less dependent upon the personalities outside of us. We are all kind of attached to our personalities. And actually, I'm kind of attached to your personalities too, because I like them. And they're very pleasing to engage with most of the time. Me too. I'm pleasing to engage with most of the time. But as my husband tells me often, people don't live with me like he does. So Jim Lewis goes on to say, when we develop this interdependence, we will discover much more within us and around us that we didn't even know existed. So when we become dependent on the Spirit, the subtleties of life begin to arise, don't they? The serendipity, the synchronicity becomes more evident. Suddenly we find ourselves in situations and there's all kinds of connections and we're thinking, oh my gosh, is this how the world really works? And yes, it does, when we're open to it. This isn't to imply that we will see things or people who are invisible. It simply means that we will have a comprehension of life that is comforting and meaningful. Visionary experiences may offer some people a false sense of comfort and reassurance, but that is nothing compared to the reassurance of the Christ, the presence of God within us. So each of us are this embodiment of the Christ, and each of us has the ability to access the Christ in all we think, say, and do. And when we let go of our personalities, or how our personalities kind of drive the boat, and we think it's driving the boat, and we think that we're getting everything we're getting in life because of our personalities, when we let go of that, when we let go of our attachment to ego, the attachment to the outcomes of our personalities, and we begin to embrace the divine love, the Christ nature that brings us to our true independence, true freedom, and our true freedom to experience abundant love, peace, wholeness, and prosperity. We see how our reactions and responses are our creations in these times. We see how we're responsible for the things that come out of our mouths and the way that we respond and react to the world, and how that affects and ripples out into the universe. And we take responsibility for it because we are essentially responsible for our happiness and our contentment. Now, the Course in Miracles says, yours is the independence of creation, not of autonomy. Your whole creative function lives in your complete dependence on God, whose function He shares with you. Now, I have to say, when I read that, initially it was a bunch of gobbledygook. But when I kind of separated it out, it tells us that as an independent being, our creativity and our possibility lies in the complete dependence of God. So all that we think that we possibly can be, all that we are creatively destined and bound to be, lies in our dependence upon our higher power, that spirit, that source. And it is God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom, as it says in Luke 12. God's good pleasure to allow us to have this kingdom. But to get to the kingdom, it takes some action. St. Augustine says, pray as though everything depended on God and work as though everything depended on you. And I say a big amen to that, because we have an important role in all of that as we are dependent on God. And we believe in this divine order and that the master plan is unfolding in our lives. We believe in the synchronicities that go along. We have to be the brains and the legs and the muscle behind it. We have to do something for it. One of my favorite sayings that I learned in Unity is the universe rewards action. And I love that saying because, especially when I'm inactive and I have to remind myself, well, if you want it to come true, you got to do something. You got to put something behind it. The universe rewards action. Now, I'm going to share just a short illustration of this, and it has to do with a congregant, and I didn't ask her for permission. So If she comes to me afterwards with a frown, then you know that, but I don't think she will. So when I think of this epitome of the universe rewards action, I think of Kathy Richmond's story. And I think about how when she started her Angels Foster Family Network and the foster care for infants, something inside of her was touched that infants really need a lot of attention at this developmental stage. They need a lot of love, attention, tactile touch. And it was her mission to make sure that she recruited foster parents for these infants that would give them the same amount of love that they would give her child. And she was dependent, totally dependent in her story about God, on God for her direction, because she didn't know anything about starting an agency, but she did it, and she got the direction, and she got the support. So divine order and purpose, our revelation, our action, lots of actions. This came through to her through the power of God, because she surrendered that, as I interpret her story. And someday, I don't know if you've ever told your story up here, Kathy, but someday you will, and you will get the full, complete version of it. And it's beautiful. It's very touching. But what it told me was that we have to surrender to what the higher power is telling us, what the universe is telling us, before we can go forward. Chief Seattle said that humankind has not woven the web of life, but we are one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. So our dependence on the web, everyone else is dependent on the web, and we're all working in that web together. We're very interdependent in this web. So Michelle gave me a book called Everybody Always, and I was reading a story in it that I wanted to share with you, because I think it illustrates the power of dependency and the importance of dependency. And in this book, Bob Goff tells wonderful stories, and they're very simple stories. And one of the stories he tells is about a man named Lex, who was blind at the age of 8. But Lex decided he was going to take up track in high school. And by the time he got to college, he realized he could run like the wind. And Bob Goff asked the obvious question, how can a blind man run track? Well, he says that Lex has a friend in front of him who runs ahead of him and calls his name. So Lex is always running towards the voice. It's a voice he knows he can trust. Now, I would say Lex is dependent upon that voice to lead him and guide him. Well, he got to college and he realized that he had to select an event, and the event that he selected was a long jump. And in the long jump, you run down a lane that's about 3 feet wide as fast as you can, and you come to a plank, and at that plank you leap and jump as far and high as you can into a sand pit. And most of us would say, well, that would be impossible if you were blind, but not Lex, because Lex has a friend with a voice he can trust. So the friend would set Lex in place, square his shoulders, set him directly on the right path, and then he would go to the other end of the sand pit, and he would yell, "Fly, fly, fly!" And Lex would take off and he would run, and when he came to the plank, he would leap as far as he could. And apparently he could leap like the wind as well as run like the wind. He was very, very good at it. Bob Goff says that Lex can jump farther than just about anyone in the world, and here's the reason why. People who are becoming love try impossible things because they surround themselves with voices they can trust. So the Paralympic World Championships came, and Lex decided to go out, and he was put on the team, and his friend put him at the end of the track, squared his shoulders, and he walked back to the sand pit. Now, Bob Goff reminds us that Lex doesn't always run in a straight line because he's blind, and sometimes he wobbles a little bit. And at this particular one, he started wobbling really bad and wandered really bad, and then when he made his launch, he completely missed the sand pit and landed on the concrete. Skinned his knees, tore his uniform. You know, he was bruised, and the crowd was just like, just like you. Yeah, it was a really hard story. So he got off the track and went, and they cleaned up his wounds. And Bob Gott said, "We're all a little blind and have a tendency to wander. Sometimes we know what caused us to stop running in a straight line, and other times we don't. We crash and burn and usually don't know what happened. It's what happens next that will tell a lot about who we're becoming." Oh, he says, "I'm no athlete, but if I were Lex, I would have been tempted to quit. I would have thought about how unfair my life was. I'd complain to myself about how far it jumped and hit hard. I might be afraid if it happened once, it might happen again." Doesn't that sound familiar? How many times? I mean, I know I can just only speak for me, that I have made an attempt in life at something and it did not go the way I wanted, and I was humiliated or embarrassed or at least very much not pleased, and I decided that's enough for me. I won't do that one again. Once burnt, never going back. And these are the sounds of defeat each of us hear at some point if we let them. These dissonant voices can drown out the voices we've come to trust in our lives. And each of us have had those voices in our past. But he reminds us that Lex doesn't see the world this way. His faith doesn't just inform his heart, it informs his whole life. So they cleaned up his knees, got him a new uniform, took him back out there. There was thunderous applause on the field, squared his shoulders, and this was going to be his last jump. Squared his shoulders. The friendly voice got to the other end of the sand pit and ran and yelled, "Fly, fly, fly!" And Lex runs, and he leaps like a gazelle. And 21 feet later, he lands and won the championship. Won it. Bob Gott says that Lex doesn't let fear call the shots in his life. We all jump for things we cannot see, each and every one of us. And sometimes we hit the concrete with a big old thud, splat. And sometimes we skin our knees, or we tear our protective ego coats, or break some bones, or the end of a relationship, or the end of our security, our job, whatever it might be. These things have happened in our life. And sometimes we even lose our faith because we aim for the soft sand and we hit the concrete. But this is what Bob Goff says. God doesn't like us more when we succeed or less when we fail. He delights in our attempts. And that truly is what this life experience is all about, is that we make these attempts to love and to grow. And there are going to be times that we take steps and we get burned. We take steps and unknowingly have volunteered for something that we should have never volunteered for. And I know, I see all the faces not looking at me as I, because we've all been there. But it's about the fact that we made the attempts. And God in the universe gives each of us unique abilities and talents. And therein lies our independence, our individuality, and our freedom. And I have to wonder if perhaps our founding fathers were listening to that voice. Fly, fly, fly. And they could trust that when they proclaimed our inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they knew that leap had no guarantee of a soft landing, and it didn't. There was no soft landing when they signed that declaration. They depended on their belief of an individual's sovereign right to listen and follow the voice that called out their name to follow truth as they know it. Our truth brings us to a deeper understanding and belief of our Christ consciousness. We get to experience that because it's been demonstrated for us. And as we continue to go in our life and relinquish more control and more dependence upon the God of our being, the greater we grow, the greater we grow. And that's something you can depend upon. Will you join me in prayer? We give you thanks, our loving Creator, for always being with us. And we hold that you gently remind us to turn it over to you at all times, that you are in control, and that we put the muscle behind it. We thank you for the wisdom that you give us, the love, the peace, the prosperity, the wholeness of life. We thank you for that. We claim this in our life right here and now, in the name, in the nature of the living Christ in us all. Amen.